What's up everybody, I am Jaspreet Singh, and if you really want to understand how to build wealth based off of everything that's going on in the economy, not only do you have to understand what's happening in the economy, but you have to understand how the economic system functions. And I've talked a lot about what's happening in the economy, but today I want to do something a little bit different and talk about how the economic system functions. That way you can find the right places to put your money and when to put your money there. Now I will say this, the best explanation on how the economic system works is a YouTube video by Ray Dalio. It's a 30-minute video where he goes over the entire economic system, and if you haven't seen that video yet, I'll link it for you down in the description. What I want to do today is kind of expand upon that topic, expand upon that video, that way you can understand how the economic system works and how you can use the economic system to your advantage. Because if you don't understand how the system works, you're going to be the one that gets used by it. So what I'm saying is, don't get used by it, use it to your advantage. The first point that you absolutely have to understand is that our economy runs on spending. The more money you spend, the more money somebody else makes. When you spend money, you're essentially funding somebody else's income, because if you have $1,000 in your pocket and you take this $1,000 and then you go to Amazon or you go to Chipotle or you go to Lululemon, well then these companies make money. If you take this $1,000 and you go buy a whole bunch of Chipotle bowls, you buy a whole bunch of extra guac, and then what happens? Well, the Chipotle store owner is going to make money, the Chipotle company is going to make money, and now they're going to have $1,000 that they can use to now invest in potentially more stores, hire more people, invest in more innovation, create better guacamole. So now they can take this money and invest it in the company, and they can use this money to also pay their employees. But if you take this $1,000 and you don't go to Chipotle and you don't spend it, and this continues to happen amongst a lot of people where people stop spending money, well then Chipotle stops making money. If they stop making money, then they don't have money to invest in more stores. They don't have money to invest in better guac. They don't have money to keep expanding, and they might even have to start cutting their costs because they don't have enough money coming in to keep paying their employees. So then what happens? Then they start laying off people. So if people stop spending money, companies stop making money, and then they no longer have money to pay their employees, and then you start to see this economic slowdown. So booms and busts in the economy ultimately come down to one thing: spending. This is why you probably hear economists and news people talking about consumer sentiment and how strong the consumer is, because the thing that everyone's paying attention to is, are people spending money? If more people are spending money, more businesses are making money, which means businesses have more money to invest in more people, invest in more infrastructure, invest in more growth, and that's what spurs the economy to grow. But the real question here is, what drives spending? And most people assume that spending is determined by one thing: money. But that's not technically true. So if we lived in a money-based society, then the way it would work is you make $40,000 a year, for example, and all you can spend is $40,000 a year. So if you make 40 grand, that's the maximum you can spend. And if you don't have any more money to spend, then you can't spend any more money. But that's not how our system works. We live in a credit-based system. That means you can spend, I spelled that wrong, credit. You can spend money or you can spend debt. Now things are a little bit different, because maybe you make $40,000 worth of money from your job, but you also have the ability to spend $20,000 worth of credit thanks to the help of banks and this credit-based system. So this credit-based system allows more spending to happen, because now you don't just have to spend money based off of how much money you have or based off of how much money you earn. You can spend money based off of how much credit you can qualify for. The more credit you qualify for, the more spending that can happen, and the more spending that happens, the more the economy can grow, and the faster the economy can grow. Now again, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, this is how the system works. Now if we expand this one step further, this is what makes up, I'll put this in red, the economy. Because the economy is now a sum of all the transactions that happen within this economic system. So it's a sum of all the spending that happens in the system. And this economy functions on three different things, three different types of spending. You can buy goods, you can buy services, or you can buy assets, financial assets, things like real estate as an investment, things like stocks, things like companies, things like bonds. So when you sum all these things, three things up, that's what the economy is, and it's made up of money and credit, and it's determined through spending. Now, while this part might be relatively simple to understand, it gets a little bit more complex, because this makes up the economy. But we have this external factor a little bit outside of the economy, which influences the economy itself too. And that has to do with the government and the central bank, the Federal Reserve Bank. So if we look at this big picture, we have an economy which is the sum of all transactions that happen. And this could be people buying goods and people buying services and people buying financial assets. And this is done through spending, where people spending money. I give you something in exchange for something else. And this is done through money and credit. It's not just the money that we earn, but we have this credit-based system where the more I earn, the more credit I qualify for, meaning the more money that I can spend. And this money and credit system is then influenced by the government and the Fed. Let me start by talking about the government here. Our government is not a for-profit entity. You can compare it to something like Chipotle, because Chipotle creates Chipotle bowls. They sell you guac, and in exchange for them doing that, you pay them money. So they sell a good in exchange for money. The government doesn't do that. They are not a for-profit entity like Chipotle is. Instead, the government gets their money from tax dollars. So then they generate this tax dollars because people like you and me, we go to work, we make money, we pay taxes. And then, after the government gets these tax dollars, they can spend this money. But the issue that the United States particularly has been facing is that the government has been spending more money than it brings in. In a purely money-based system, what you would want is you would want your income to be greater than or equal to your expenses. I mean, think about anything else. If you make $40,000 a year, you don't want to spend more than 40 grand a year because then otherwise you're in the hole. So it works the same with the government. But that's not what happens. Right now we have this massive amount of national debt. We have this national deficit. We have this growing debt bubble that people talk about. And so all these things mean is that the government has more expenses than income. So they bring in their tax dollars right here, and it is not enough to cover these expenses. And so if the government is spending more money than they bring in, what do? Well, they have to go and borrow this money. Remember, credit-based system. And where does the government go to borrow money? Because when you want to borrow money to buy a home, you just go to the bank. Well, it's a little bit different for the government. What the government does is first they will go to different countries. They can go to places like China and Japan, and they can say, lend us some money. And if they can't get enough money there, then they might go to private citizens, people like you and me, and they can say, hey, do you want to loan money to your government? This is called a treasury bond. A treasury bond is when you loan money to the government. And if they can't get enough money from regular people, then they call up somebody else. They call up the Federal Reserve Bank. And this is where things get even more interesting because it's called the Federal Reserve Bank. However, they're not federal. It says so on their website. They don't keep any cash reserves anywhere, and they're not a bank. You and I can't go there to bank. So they have this name, the Federal Reserve Bank, even though they're not federal, they're not a reserve, and they are not a bank. However, they are the central bank, and what they have the ability to do is they have the ability to control this. They are in charge of monitoring and controlling the money supply. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself right now, so let me take one quick step back. So the government now needs to spend more money, or they have more expenses than they have income. So what do? Well, they'll issue these treasury bonds, and then they'll call up the Federal Reserve Bank and they'll say, hey Fed, we just issued $1 trillion worth of treasury bonds and we need somebody to buy them. We need this $1 trillion, so the government needs a loan. So what happens? That's when the Fed will then print $1 trillion essentially out of thin air, because remember, they don't have cash reserves anywhere. They have the ability to control the monetary supply, so they can print this money out of thin air. They give it to the government, and now the government has just gotten $1 trillion. They issued $1 trillion bond, meaning they put out a request to borrow $1 trillion, and they couldn't get this money from somewhere else, so the Fed prints this money, they give it to the government, and now the government has $1 trillion that they can use to fund their government operations, to fund whatever systems that they want to help their citizens, or supposedly and hopefully help their citizens. So now we have this economic system made up of people selling goods, people selling services, and people selling financial assets, and in order for the economy to function, you need people to spend money. But they're not just spending money, they're also spending money and credit. The more that is spent, the more the economy grows. And then this money and credit system is controlled by the Federal Reserve Bank and the government as well indirectly, because when the government needs more money, they will call up the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, while the system works and it has worked well, there are a couple issues that come through this system. The first one is inflation, and the second one are economic cycles. Most people assume that inflation means that the price of things are going up, but that's not the real definition of inflation. Inflation comes from the word inflate. What are you inflating when you have inflation? You're inflating the monetary supply. You're inflating the amount of dollars out there because then you have more dollars, which decreases the value of each individual dollar. Because our money, what we call money, your money and credit, is really just fiat currency. It's pieces of paper that was created by the government, and they said that this paper has money. Back in the day, before the early 1970s, our money was backed by physical gold. So it was backed by a metal. There was a limited supply of this metal. It took time, effort, and labor to mine this physical metal. But nowadays, it costs less than 12 cents to print a $100 bill. So we can print an infinite amount of money essentially out of thin air. So the more money we create, the value of each individual dollar goes down. That's what inflation is, and in return, that causes the price of things to go up. The price of things going up is a byproduct of inflation. And then on the flip side, you have the issue of economic cycles, because now when you live in this credit-based system, it's good because it can allow the economy to grow significantly faster, because now you're not just spending based off of how much you earn, you're spending based off of how much you can qualify for, how much credit you can qualify for. So it allows more spending